Hello, Advanced Motion Design. Emily here. I wanted to talk about creating depth today in our lecture, and you could see that I have this very realistic performance here taking place on a 3D, or more specifically 2.5D stage, in which we can have lighting, shadows, and create a sense of depth. I just want to do a little bit of review first before we get into recreating something similar to this. So I'm just going to click on my new composition button. I want a 1920 by 1080 composition. I usually use the HDTV 1080 preset. We want square pixels since we're going to be importing things from Photoshop. And as far as the frame rate goes, 29.97 is for film. That's really only important if we're going to be working with video. We're really just animating here. So if we want, we can make that 24 frames a second instead, which is a little bit more standard for animation. And for the duration, let's make this, well, this doesn't matter because we're just doing a little test here, but let's make this 5 seconds. And the background color doesn't matter because we're going to be adding a solid anyways. And in order to create 3D, we need a few essential elements. We need a subject, we need a light, and we need something to catch the shadow of that subject. So first, let's get our subject here. And very creatively, I'm going to type out the word review. Wow, I do not know why that font was selected. Um, but you know what? Let's go with it. No, actually, I think this Onyx one's pretty classy. I'm just going to scale this up a little bit. So we have our object, and to make this object 3D, we just have to click on its toggle switch over here. If you don't see the toggle switches, you would click on this little toggle switches and modes icon at the bottom. And so the toggle switch for 3D is the little cube. And once you do that, if you look at something like position, you'll see you get a third digit here, which is Z, or depth. It's distance from the camera. We're not working with cameras yet, but the default view is called active camera, and that's just our point of view and what it's going to render like. So we really can't perceive the depth just through position. This just looks like scale. If we click R for rotation, you could see we have 3 different options now in a different orientation. So if I want to rotate along the Y, the X, or the Z, I can. So if you're not worried about shadow or lighting, or just want an interesting way to reveal text, if you have it rotate from 0 degrees into whatever you want, that's always fun. Otherwise, to get 3D, we want to add a light and background. So we have our 3D object. Now I'm just going to add our light, which is a layer type, layer new light. And I'm going to create a spotlight that's just white. I'm going to bring the intensity up to 100. We can always type that in. And any of these settings we can change at any time by double clicking on the layer once it's added. Some of these will be hard to visualize until you add it. Really, the most important thing here is cast shadows is checked on. So I'm going to click OK. And not very dramatic yet, but if we click on P for position on our spotlight, we can move it around. Now we're going to have a much better idea of where things are located if we have our layer controls turned on. The shortcut for that is just Shift Command H, and now you can see the axes for our light, which is by default a 3D object. That's why it has X, Y, and Z handles. Review has those 3 as now as well. Though if I turn the cube off, you could see it goes back to just a flat old object. Well, let's just undo twice there. And so if I click on my light, I can move it along the X, Y, and Z. I can change the depth. So the closer it gets to the text, I get a little bit more specific of a highlight. Like I said, if I double click on the light, I can do things like change the intensity, change the cone angle, and any one of these values can be animated if I just twirl down my light options and go to light options. That's not redundant at all. So transform is where you find rotation, position, etc. Point of interest is what specifically the light is pointing at. That's going to be important with our stage demo. But if I collapse the transform options, here you can see all those things that we can edit and therefore animate. So if I want to change something like the color, I can do that really easily here. That looks very attractive. Now we have lighting on the text or subject, but we don't have a shadow, and that's because we don't have a background yet. Remember, the composition background is actually an alpha channel. So I'm going to create a solid, or I could import a background, layer new solid. Let's make this a dark red and click OK. Layer order really doesn't matter when objects are 3D. This is just on the top because it's not 3D. But once I hit that cube, you can see it now has the XYZ handles. It's responding to the light. And if I just push this back, if I click P for position and scrub the Z, I can move that away from us. Now it's kind of hard to visualize, so remember that when working with 3D, we can work with multiple views. So at the bottom of the composition window, if I click where it says one view and go to 2, now this is a left side view of our light, the subject, and the background. I prefer working in a top-down view, though it really depends on what you're animating. So here we have the light with its cone, our angled text, and then the background shape. Typically, your background's going to have to be increased in scale, so make sure it's a higher resolution in order to handle that. We don't need to worry about that with the solid. I'm just going to click S for scale and scale that up. Now, even though we have our light and background, we don't have a cast shadow, and that's because cast shadows is off by default. That might seem inconvenient, but shadows can add a lot of render time. So I just need to go to my subject. You can see here that the layer order does not matter anymore. It's whatever's closest to the active camera. I'm going to click on Review and twirl down the options. In addition to text and transform, we now have material options. Geometry options will actually be accessible when we work with the Cinema 4D renderer later in the semester. And so under material options, the very first option is cast shadows. I'm going to turn that to on. And now we have this very dramatic shadow behind it. I am going to reset the rotation on this text. I'm just going to click R for rotation. And let's just go back to 0 for that. And then I'm just going to click on my light and I'm just going to scrub it backwards a little bit. And now you can see very simply we have our light, subject, background, and therefore shadow. We don't need to have the background cast a shadow because there's nothing behind it. However, if you went through these steps, just troubleshooting wise, you want to make sure that your light is set to cast shadows. You want to make sure that your background is set to accept shadows. So not casting, but accepting them. And then your subject, like we just said, has to make sure that it is set to cast shadows. So it's quite a few steps, but I think it's worth it in the end. And I can show you, oh, by the way, there's 3 options here, on, off, and only. So if you wanted just the shadow of something, which might seem like a weird idea, but it's useful in compositing when you're casting the shadows of an object for special effects, I'm going to go back to just on here. But you can see the difference between them, and it might not seem like a big deal, but when you work with something that has shadow to it, let me just go to just this one view. I'm going to turn off my guide, so I'm going Shift Command H. That just hid my layer controls, so I'm actually going to go View and turn off Show Guides. But this is just my 3D stage that I created. I'm going to go over those steps next. I just want you to see how different it looks when I turn the lighting off. Pretty attractive, right? You can see there's really no depth at all on the screen. And this one I actually had already rotated the floor. The Photoshop file that you can download is available in the week 3 folder. And it has just the front curtains, the middle curtains, and then this floor. Those are the three layers we need in order to create this stage. So in order to create that, I actually need to import a Photoshop file in order to get these multiple layers. Oh, spoiler alert, we're going to be working with Misty Copeland in just a moment. But if I go back to this RAM previewed example, you can see we have the curtain opening, and these different lights are kind of following the dancers. Something really cool is that you can have multiple lights. You can see two shadows spilling onto the floor here. The floor itself is rotated down so that we're able to get those shadows there. And there should really be a motion blur here, especially for this trapeze artist. However, lighting takes a long time to render, and motion blur takes even longer. So just like the toggle for 3D, motion blur is just this little 3-circle column. And if I turn on the motion blur for the file, the master switch up here, we can just see it's adds a little bit of a blur when somebody's moving. So if I turn that on and off, it's not a huge difference. You could see it more with some of these dancers when they're moving faster. Ballerinas aren't probably going to have the most motion blur ever, but there you can see just kind of a feathered edge that's going to become more distorted the faster a subject is. If you use motion blur, you can target the different layers that use it, but then turn that master switch off just so that your RAM previewing doesn't take so long. So just a few pointers there. Now, if we want to create this stage from scratch, I have just kind of a blank one here, like I said, but I'm going to tell you how to import it as well. Like I said, the layered PSD file is in the week 3 folder in addition to all of our lovely dancers here. But to import the file, never mind the layers I have here already, you can only have one project open at a time in After Effects, so I'm just going to keep this one open and just import my assets. So I can double click in this gray space or go File, Import, File, kind of redundant. And I want to navigate to wherever I stored that file. I have a folder specifically called Stage with all of my assets in it. Whenever you're working in After Effects, I highly recommend having a folder with the assets just because the file paths are crucial for it to work properly. So you could see the individual pings I put together here. I could import those one by one, but when you have a specific setup and layout you want, it's better to make that in Photoshop or Illustrator and then import the layered files. Alright, so I have my PSD selected, and the default is going to try to bring it in as footage, which is only going to allow us to bring in one layer or merge all the layers. So if I click open, it's actually smart enough to tell me, hey, this is a composition, but I'm going to say no. And if it kept some footage settings, it would say merge layers or just one specific layer. And there's nothing wrong with this if I just need to add a logo that was embedded in another project. But for this, we want to bring it in as a composition. I always choose retain layer sizes, just because that makes it the size of the bounding box versus the composition. With this file, it's not as important because all of the layers are the size of the composition, but I'll demo why this is useful in the next lecture. And then I have some layer styles. I'm just going to merge them in. It's only because in Photoshop, I added some smart filters just to add some level adjustment, which we can also do in After Effects. So I want composition, retain layer sizes. I'm going to click OK. And then that actually creates a scene based on my Photoshop file. So remember, I've got more stuff in my project window here. But if I twirl down the layers folder it made, you can see we have the individual layers here. If I double click on it, it's going to open it up in stage mode, and I just happen to click on the one that's all black. So we can see our individual layers here and see that there's the transparency. And it also created a composition for us. So here's just stage scene 03. I already have 01 and 2, so it automatically created a new number for me. And so like I showed before, this is a pretty unimpressive file without adding any 3D or lighting to it. So the first thing we're going to do is actually delete that background layer because we don't need it. I'm going to select these three layers here and I'm going to make them 3D. So I'm going to click on that column. And if we were to look at the two views here, when you're looking at the other view for 3D, you're not going to see it unless it has that cube. So right now we can't perceive any kind of XYZ kind of thing. But if I click on that cube column, it's like looking down at a piece of paper. There's not really any thickness to it. And if we click on the individual layers, we can see those X, Y, and Z handles. Sometimes it might be better to work from the top or left. Doesn't really matter. It's your preference. But I'm going to click on this first curtain here, which are the front ones, and I'm going to pull them forward along the Z. So it's just going to make them look bigger as it comes closer to us. I'm going to click on those other curtains and push them back, which I can do by scrubbing that position element or by using the handle. And obviously the floor is a problem because we want it to be rotated down. So we really can't perceive depth here because we don't have lighting. Just real quick, let's go layer new light, click OK. We definitely can see the effect of the lighting. This is a spotlight, which is very appropriate. So both of these layers are obviously accepting light, but this top one is not casting a shadow. So I would just go to that layer, I'd twirl it down, go to material options, and check on cast shadow. And that is really harsh, but you can see it's casting a shadow now. And I can actually adjust how intense the shadow is. If I diffuse the lighting, I can make the lighting less intense, which we're going to want to do for our performers. And if I double click on the light options, by double clicking on it itself, I can adjust the shadow darkness. So this is already darker than normal. I can just scrub this to not as high of a number. I could also diffuse the shadow as well. So I can give it a harder or softer edge and change the darkness within the light option settings. So that looks better, but we still need our floor. I'm going to turn off these other two layers for just a moment and go to our floor layer. So if the floor, we actually want to rotate it back. I'm going to click R for rotation, and let me collapse these other layers here. So with the floor selected, we can change it along the X, the Y, or the Z. In this case, we want to rotate it along the X to make it a flat plane. In fact, we're just going to rotate it 90 degrees. I'm just going to type in 90. And because we're looking at it from a front-on view, we're getting that same kind of effect of looking down at the other layers. In fact, if I switch to the top view now, you can actually see the floor from looking at the top down. So I'm going to turn those other curtain layers on. And you can see that doesn't really work yet, but that's just because we need to move it down along the Y. So I'm going to click on the floor and click P for position. I can just scrub the Y here, and you can see I can get it into the right spot. One thing I like to do when working with 3D is to right-click on position and choose separate dimensions. Then that's going to give me a separate attribute for X, Y, and Z, and I just find this easier to animate in general. So I need to change the Y to drop it down. And then it's clear I need to do some adjustments still. For example, my curtains are just kind of going through the floor, and I need to move this other one back. And these front curtains, we really need to lift these up a little bit. So I'm going to move these back and then drag them up. We want to actually see the bottom of the curtains, otherwise they stick right into the floor. And same thing with this other curtain. We're just going to push it back along the Z, drag it up along the Y. If you don't like using the axes, remember we have the X, Y, and Z options. So if I click P for position, they're all one, but if I right click, I can separate those dimensions and then just animate it from there. So it's really just a matter of your preference. Normally when we move things back, we have to rescale them. So for these curtains, I'm just going to click S for scale and scale them up a little bit, which is going to require me to move them up some more. All right, that's looking pretty good. And then we can kind of test everything by turning that light back on. All right, so this middle curtain here is definitely getting a little too much light. So I could push it further away from the light source, which can make it darker. But I can also change how much light is being diffused on it. If I twirl down my options for this layer, and instead of going to transform, go to material options, I can diffuse this light a little bit. So not too much, but I just don't want it to be quite as intense and bright. And also this isn't casting a shadow right now because we really don't see behind it. So now that we have our floor, which is rotated, and we have our two spaced out curtains and our light, the space between the curtains is important because then we can have our actor or performer go through here. I think this is looking pretty good, so I'm going to add one of my dancers. You can import whatever subject you want. I have a performers folder that you can import individual performers here. I'm sorry, they're mostly ballerinas. That's not usually my style either. But I do have an awesome ballerina here by the name of Misty Copeland. So Misty I saved as a ping after removing the background in Photoshop. But even though I feel like I masked it pretty well, there's still just kind of an edge around here. Let's switch to just one view for a moment here. So there's still a little bit of an edge around this, and I could change the Photoshop file, and then when I save, it will update this one. Though in this case, I'd have to re-export the ping. After Effects is used a lot for compositing. In fact, I teach a class just about compositing and special effects. And one of the things we can do is add a matte, which just kind of reduces the edge like the mask feature would within Photoshop. So I'm just going to go to my Effect menu, go to the Matte menu, and there's a few options here, but let's just do Simple Choker. And that just means it's going to bring the line in a little bit. So by default it's 0. If we went too far in, you'll be able to tell. And if you go out, you're actually going to add an outline around the object, which is kind of a cool look if you're going for it. I just want to bring it in a tiny bit. A tiny bit more. I'm watching those fingers to make sure I don't lose them. So it's really subtle, but if we turn the effect on and off by clicking on the effects icon, you could see we did a pretty good job removing that outer edge. But really the best idea is to have your assets as prepared as possible. I'm going to fit, and so we have our performer here. However, she's not a 3D object yet, so she's not going to accept any of the lights or cast shadows yet, or interact with any of our scene. She's just kind of on top of it. But look at this dancing performance. I won't actually do that. So we need to make her layer 3D, so I'm just going to click on it and click on the little cube icon. And right away, we don't have cast shadows because it's not the default. And we need to adjust her Y position. Her feet are kind of sunk in the floor like the curtains were. And we need to diffuse the light because it's way too bright on her right now. So I'm just going to twirl down her options, go to material options, and I'm going to turn on cast shadows. So we get that nice shadow behind her. The curtains are close enough to catch them. I'm going to click on her and click P for position and just move her up a little bit. Before I do any animating, one of the things you want to consider is where your anchor point is. It's not something you want to move after you animate because it's going to change your keyframes potentially. So if I turn my layer controls on by going Shift Command H, or View Show Layer Controls, I can see that, like with most layers, her axis is right in the middle of the asset. So if I clicked S for scale, that's where it would scale from. Knowing where your anchor point is, whether it's a 2D or 3D layer, is crucial to getting the animation that you want. That's where all changes are going to occur from. For instance, in that first animated scene, I have this trapeze artist, and with her, if I click on her layer and go Shift Command H, you could see I moved her anchor point to the top of her layer. If I was to add her, let's say, into this scene, so I'm just going to go by project window and drag her in here. It's a party now. If I was to rotate her, she's going to rotate from that middle point. However, if I move that anchor point, which you can click A to scrub to a different point, which I find irritating, instead I like using the pan behind tool, which is between the camera and shape tools. And then you could actually just drag that anchor point wherever you want. If you hold down Command, you could snap it into place. And now when I rotate it, it rotates from that point. So just a better approach, especially when you are going to be animating movement and scale. You want to have that figured out first. So going back to our prima ballerina here, we definitely need to diffuse this lighting. So I'm just going to twirl down the options, go to material options, and diffuse the light a little bit. Of course, the position of the light or additional lights matters as well as far as brightness goes. If I was to go layer, new light, I can add a second spotlight, and this one is really focused on her. I'm just going to pull this back. You can see no amount of diffusion can save someone from that, but if I move this over and I make the light itself more dim, and a smaller cone angle and feather, we can adjust this to be more of a spotlight. So I'm going to switch back to my move tool. And with a light, there's the position and then there's the point of interest. That's what it's pointing at. So when you have cast shadows turned on and multiple lights, you actually can get this kind of cross-sectional light like you would in a real stage. So when we have a performer on there, you can actually see light coming from multiple directions, casting multiple shadows. So I'm just going to click S for scale and bring her down. But because the anchor point's in the middle, that's where it's scaling towards. So if I undo, go to pan behind and command drag rather, that point to the middle. Now when I click S for scale and bring her down, I don't need to adjust the position for the Y. So again, just make sure you know where that origin point is. And then from there, I can do my very realistic animation of dance. So I'm just going to click P for position. Again, I'm going to right click and separate dimensions. I'm just going to use X and scrub her off the screen. I'm going to click on my stopwatch, move my playhead forward. I'll have her come out to the halfway point here. I could also use my axes as long as I have the move tool again. I don't want pan behind because I don't want to change that right now. And that's a really fast animation, but we can see her come out from behind the curtain there. Doesn't look fast while it's RAM previewing, but you can see even with that, it took a moment. I'm gonna reduce my work area here. She just naturally slides out. Maybe I should have used ice skaters. Let's slow that down just a little bit by separating those keyframes. But then I can go in and animate this however I see fit. Now my computer has definitely been having difficulties with After Effects. Like when I RAM preview this, right now my CPU is up to 400%, and shadows are a large part of that. So if I know I want shadows at the end, but I don't want to wait to RAM preview it, remember you can turn down the quality of the RAM preview. This doesn't change the end resolution, it just makes it that much easier to preview. And I think we're done here. I mean, how could it look better? It could look better a lot of ways. But I can have her do a little jump or whatever. Mostly, I just wanted to talk about the lights themselves and creating the sense of depth. Your exercise is to download this stage PSD file and recreate this scene. You can use whatever subject you want and use whatever lighting. I just want to make sure that you understand 3D, or rather 2.5D layers, the dimensions, the spaces between them, and then how light and shadow works. So if you want to use a different file, that's fine. I just want to be able to see clearly the lighting between subject, background, and the shadows between. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'm sure you can do a little bit more realistic animation than this, though that wasn't my goal. I think it's kind of funny actually, but I have a strange sense of humor. So I hope you enjoyed this exercise. Let me know if you have any questions and have fun recreating it and making it your own.